I want to welcome you all to our first lecture for the fall semester from the Center for South Asia. As you walked in, I hope you grabbed a piece of cake. This is a very important cake to make your mouth sweet as we start the semester. And it's also a cake to make Narayana Rao's mouth sweet as he leaves and goes to Chicago for teaching for a year. He's been teaching here at the university for 28 years, Telugu literature and language. He was one of the founding members to start the folklore program here. And this is a non-retirement cake because he is not retiring, but he's continuing on to teach. And we will hope to see him back here many, many times. But he definitely did not want a retirement cake, but we invited him here and we invited one of his friends to give a talk so that he would have to come here and introduce them. And that's the way we snuck this in. So he did not know about it, but hopefully you will enjoy the cake, and he will have enjoyed it as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also have, before I turn this over to Narayana Rao to introduce our speaker, we have a Tibet Festival starting tomorrow. There's posters on the back. Please grab one and put it around campus. This is the first Tibet Festival in Wisconsin, and we hope there will be many more, co-sponsored by the Center and the Wisconsin Tibet Association. There's lectures tomorrow in the State Historical Society and a performance of Tibetan culture. On Saturday, there's lectures in the Pyle Center and a film. There's lectures on Sunday on the Pyle Center and a film. And there will be on Library Mall Saturday and Sunday, in conjunction with the Iron Man, there will be a Tibet Festival. So you can run, swim, cycle, and then go see Tibetan culture. So there are all kinds of things happening together. So pick some of these posters up, take them around campus, post them, please. We want to have a lot of people down there. And with that, I will turn it over to Narayana Rao to introduce our speaker, Deepika Bahri from Emory University.
First of all, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everybody at the center who were very sweet idea of making a cake. I really appreciate the sentiment. As I was told, I'm not leaving anyway. I'm not too far away. So it's not actually retirement in that sense. Now, talking about Deepika Bahri, it's not easy to introduce a person who has been very active in the field of postcolonial studies with South Asia at the center. She has done so much work in Emory University that during the time I was there, nearly everybody was talking about her work and the work she does for the center there. Apart from being an excellent teacher, she's a wonderful speaker. The work she has done, if I were to go through all that, will take much time of yours and hers, because she is already worried that she may not be able to complete her talk before the end of the time we have given her. But one thing I want to say, she is one of the few postcolonialists who has concentrated on the aesthetics of postcolonialism. Usually you hear a lot of politics of it. She is the one who concentrated on the aesthetics of postcolonialism. In that book, Native Intelligence, Aesthetics, Politics, and Postcolonial Literature from Minneapolis, 2003. It's really an excellent book. I learned a lot by reading the book. It's an extraordinary survey of what happened in South Asian postcolonial literature, connecting them aesthetically to modern aesthetical thinkers of Europe. If I have to talk about the list of the papers she has presented, it's a huge list. And I do not want to really go through all of them. She has, I have heard her introduce speakers in Emory University, an excellent way of introducing a person. And I wish I could emulate her, but I don't think I can. So without talking much more, I want to give you Deepika Bahri talking about the topic what happened to race in South Asia, a very controversial topic, curious case of Salman Rushdie. Deepika Bahri.
Thanks very much, Narayana Rao. It's not often one gets a formidable figure in the field to introduce one. I'm very grateful to you for inviting me here, Mark, for his kind welcome here. All of you for showing up. I mean, you baked a cake and everything. That's wonderful. Let me fire away, since I understand that some of you may have class at 1, and I have about 40 minutes or so. So without further ado, let me start by telling you that as a young girl, I remember being very amused by a children's poem that was doing the rounds at school. It went something like this, and some of you may know it because it was an American educator and poet who wrote it. It goes like this. As I was walking up the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd stay away. As a child, I was quite untroubled by the paradox of meeting a man who wasn't there, uninterested in the poet or the poem's context, which incidentally is a response to a haunting of a house in Antigonish, Canada, and quite content to be stirred by what I might now pretentiously describe as childish intimations of the uncanny. But years later, the lines returned to me as I read descriptions of the ghost of Joseph DaCosta in Salman Rushdie's novel Midnight's Children. Joseph DaCosta, if you haven't read the novel lately, is the love interest of Mary Pereira, Salim's nanny, formerly midwife at the nursing home where Salim, the narrator, was born. Joseph is an orderly there and presented as a radical class activist, a figure for the troubled masses, whose ghost, I think, is Rushdie's tongue-in-cheek reference to the Marxist idea, the specter of communism. It is in order to curry favor with Joseph's subversive credo, and thus hopefully to gain his love, that Mary impulsively commits her own private revolutionary act of switching the name tags of 2 infants born at the nursing home at the same hour, sealing their fate by, quote, giving the poor baby a life of privilege and condemning the rich-born child to accordions and poverty. Shortly after this domestic-scaled version of class reversal, Joseph is captured with homemade bombs and killed by the police. No longer there, he nonetheless continues to haunt Mary for 11 years, appearing to her on the stair and everywhere around the Sinai family's home, Buckingham Villa. Visions of Joseph's ghost ultimately terrorize her into confessing her crime years after remorse has already moved her to gain employment as Salim's nanny. It is fitting, of course, that the still virgin Mary should become his surrogate mother, having given birth to the child's new identity. Thanks to the crime of Mary Pereira, Salim tells us, I became the chosen child of midnight. And thanks to the crimes of colonialism, Midnight's Children would become the chosen text of postcolonialism, winning the Booker Prize with its publication in 1981, the Booker of Bookers in 1993, and the Best of the Booker in 2008. In a glowing review of the novel in the New York Times, Clark Blaze notes that Midnight's Children sounds like a country finding its voice. But Salim, the voice of the nation, is born not only of the class-interested crime of Mary for her Joseph, but something like a crime wave, in which we might include the crimes of colonialism, which produced the empire, educated it in the English language, and now rewards it lavishly for writing back in it. Originally destined for the slums where his doppelganger Shiva languishes for much of the narrative, Salim is saved by, quote, education of class origins, as he puts it, allowing him to tell the story of the nation by, quote, a show of erudition and the purity of my accents. Courtesy, the legacy of an education originally intended to form, you will recognize these words, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, in Macaulay's well-known words. But behind closed doors, privately, other crimes have occurred, crimes of passion, if you will, which have produced, or rather reproduced, another class of persons. Salim may have been born into his life of privilege by Mary's unconsummated love for her Joseph, and class positioned by her to redeem the pledge of midnight and give voice to its children, but he is also the result of another not so immaculate conception. The voice of the country, as Salim's audience figure Padma discovers to her scandalized horror, is an Anglo, which is to say, he is a racially hybrid product of an afternoon's passion between two unlikely sociogenetic partners. One of them is the departing British proprietor of the Sinai family's new home, one William Methwold, named after a historical figure, and the other is a poor street singer's wife, Vanita. In a long tradition of Anglo-Indian mixture, the encounters usually involved a European father and a poor Indian bibi or concubine. Unbeknownst to his Kashmiri Muslim parents and indeed to Mary, Salim Sinai is a product of one such alliance featuring, typically enough, consort between a privileged white male and a usually poor, hapless Indian woman motivated by a mixture of economic and other under-investigated desires. These crimes of passion would of course be followed by others, of abandonment, discrimination, and disenfranchisement, not only by colonial fathers, but also by the post-colonial nation. In the historical archive, these unions would produce a class of persons who are identified in the Indian Constitution as Anglo-Indian, meaning a person whose father or any of whose other male progenitors in the male line is or was of European descent. Although the term confusingly describes Anglophone writing or a colonial English person living in India as well, growing up in India, we knew that it, or the more handy word Anglo, described an encounter between two peoples, European and Indian, between the sheets, as we used to say when reading, Chinese fortune cookies, which said, you have a wonderful future between the sheets, we used to add and giggle. The sort of, things you didn't talk about. While Macaulay's culturally hybrid Minutemen monopolized post-colonial discussions, somehow we've managed to miss a whole range of between the sheets encounters in successive waves of European colonial ventures into India. But Rushdie chooses just such a product to relate a gin-sodden history haunted by the remembrance of things past. In this mode of remembrance, the private realm is not the pure spiritual domain of Partha Chatterjee's formulation, The Nation and Its Fragments, but a space marked by religious, racial, and cultural mixture. In this mode of remembrance, the ghost of Joseph de Costa, the man who wasn't there, might be read not only as an arch reference to the specter of class, but also that of race and racial encounter. His name encodes an even older memory of mixture, one that took place between Indians and the Portuguese, whom Salim calls the first invaders. This spectre exhumes a whole another history of Salim's begetting and legacy, sounded in the names of the De Costas, the Pereiras, the Fernandezes, the Alonsos, Sulacos, Colacos, and indeed one Mr. Emil Zagallo, his teacher who, quote, claimed to be Peruvian and was fond of calling us jungle Indians, bead lovers, who would swish his cane through the stone-walled air. We called him Pagal Zagal, crazy Zagallo, because for all his talk of llamas and conquistadores and the Pacific Ocean, we knew with the absolute certainty of rumor that he'd been born in a Mazagaon tenement and his Goanese mother had been abandoned by a decamped shipping agent. So he was not only an Anglo, but probably a bastard as well. Knowing this, we understood why Zagallo affected his Latin accent and also why he was always in a fury, why he beat his fists against the stone walls of the classroom. But the knowledge didn't stop us being afraid. When Salim insists that the children of midnight and he had been fathered, you understand, by history, he wants us to remember, quote, the wild profusion of his inheritance, which includes not only Shivaji and fishermen, but also Catherine of Braganza, the seduction of an accordionist's wife, Blue Jesus, Mary's desperation, Joseph's revolutionary wildness, and the flightiness of Alice Pereira. Remember, remember, he says to Padma, claiming a complex Indian colonial and Anglo-Indian parentage. All these made me too. But as the candid Salim will also point out, we are a nation of forgetters. Scholarship on Midnight's Children has ignored almost wholesale the racially complex identity of the child chosen by Rushdie to narrate The Nation. There are good reasons for this, of course. The novel itself is invested in representing the hybridity of all of India, not just the Anglo-Indian community. And because the racially hybrid person is so very serviceable as a potent and efficient symbol for this condition, one is apt to lose sight of its historical coordinates within the specific context of miscegenation. Midnight's Children, like so much of Rushdie's fiction, is also, equally defensively, devoted to emphasizing that all given, received, and assumed identities are complex and open to investigation. But Rushdie is just as alert to these issues as he is to the problem of race qua race. Given his record, we would do well to wonder, why does Salman Rushdie repeatedly choose a racial hybrid in Grimace, Shame, The Moor's Last Sigh, and Shalimar the Clown to explore the question of hybridity? Why not simply choose a cultural hybrid if that would be just as efficient a vehicle for broaching the complexities of identity? Moreover, apart from using the voice of a half-caste changeling, Midnight's Children refers to a range of other Anglos, describing stereotypes about their presumed sexual promiscuity, their complex history, their distinctive linguistic tics within the lexicon of Indian English usage, an incipient exploration, as with Zagallo, of the trauma of racial hybridity. These and other racially charged issues in Rushdie's writing have drawn no more attention than the very marked identity of the chosen child of midnight. But then, let me say, inattention to race is hardly unusual for South Asian scholarship. To understate the case somewhat, race is not a topic that features prominently in postcolonial criticism or theory of South Asian provenance. Why, we wonder, this founding exclusion in a discourse usually so alert to questions of subordination and difference as to have dominated postcolonial theory for decades on these topics? Even when it seems like it is the focus, as in Homi Bhabha's well-circulated concept of hybridity, a signature term in postcolonial theory, race disappears into the ambivalent discourse of linguistic and cultural hybridity. One might argue that the absence of a topic from consideration is not in itself warrant for paying attention to it. But absence from consideration is not the same as absence from the South Asian text. In other words, blindness cannot be unproblematically recast as absence. The disappearance of race from South Asian discourse presents as a forensic problem. What happened to race is not just a collective who done it, we all done it, but a why and how done it, given that the problem of race can be as plain as the nose on Salim's face, not only in Midnight's Children, but in a great deal of postcolonial literature and film that is teeming with racially hybrid characters who ask us to remember, to remember. When race is not there to be seen steadily and whole, it can appear quite like Joseph's ghost, which appears to Mary to be missing an ear, toes, most of its teeth, and part of its stomach, in flagrant fragments, as sexual promiscuity, weirdness, inconsonant consonants, and improper grammar. In a different version of color consciousness, the racial sense also emerges in obsessions with fair and lovely complexions. This is not news to anyone. And the deification of green-eyed cine goddesses such as Aishwarya Rai and a colored contact lens-wearing horde of lesser starlets. Then, as now, in the colonial and post-colonial phase, racial difference haunts the South Asian imaginary while failing to capture the imagination of scholars on South Asia. Let me speculate on some of the reasons why this is so. A meaningful confrontation with the question of race may well have been delayed in the entire field of postcolonial studies, including Anglophone South Asian literature, because the field emerged in the 80s, just about when Midnight's Children was published, at a time when race was being discredited as fiction, both in the biological sciences and, of course, in literary theory. The challenge of that moment was to accept its fictional quality without rejecting its continuing relevance. Instead of assuming this challenge, the study of postcolonial literature and culture developed within a decidedly postmodern and post-structuralist frame that rejected the essentialist paradigms with which the concept of race had been associated. The widespread currency of Baba's concept of hybridity, originally developed in the disciplines of anthropology, biology, and botany, thus would paradoxically draw attention away from the question of race and toward language, culture, and mimicry, rather than their complex interplay with biology. But the confinement of hybridity to semiotic terrain costs us a better understanding of racial mixing within colonialism, as well as on the overlooked continuum between black and white, where brown is also a distinctly raced color. Postmodern accounts of hybridity aim to undo the colonial postcolonial binary quite productively, we would all agree, but they remain limited if they offer no satisfactory account of identity in a specifically historical context, no substantive account of agency in the colonial or postcolonial subject, and little understanding that mixture of race, in this instance, may actually consolidate a belief in essential differences. Returning the study of hybridity to its colonial historical context in India will go a long way toward helping us understand the phenomena of racism, subalternity, passing, mimicry, and even cosmopolitanism and diaspora pressed through the prism of Anglo-Indian experience. One wonders what these very key terms in postcolonial studies would look like if we actually looked at them through the racially hybrid experience. But it would not be enough. We must also continue to investigate the origins of the term in anthropology, biology, and botany to test their resilience and relevance for our understanding of the broad ramifications of race today. In recent years, a spate of critical works has persuasively begun to argue for a re-evaluation of the hitherto overlooked historical nexus of race and aesthetics. I see this, given my record, as a novel and promising line of inquiry as I continue to explore the relay between aesthetics and politics. And yet, my probing of hybridity, one of the greatest hits of postcolonial theory, if I may say so, suggests that a return to the origins of the term in biological theories may have as much to teach us about the complex interplay of race, culture, and aesthetic categories as a linguistic and cultural turn away from it by alerting us to the bodily dimension of racial thought. As I hope to be able to argue at some length in my reading of Race in Subcontinental Fiction, the larger project from which this talk is drawn, in the current scholarly dispensation, we have learned more about how biology is aestheticized than we have about its persistence as a social fact, founded in the ways difference continues to be biologized as inherency, which is a term I use for its etymological suggestions. It derives from the Latin in plus herere, to be connected with, adhere to stick. To suggest that difference continues to be biologized as inherency is not to say that race is essential, but that essentialization can nonetheless be understood as a practice, and a practice that is shored up by that which is written in the body and what it produces, not only by way of its cultural and artistic expression, but also its bodily and reproductive one. A different apprehension of the connections between race and aesthetics would reinstate the significance of the bodily and biological to both terms, race and aesthetics, uncovering what is already suggested in the idea of aesthesis as not simply the production of works of art, but as the capacity for sensation and perception in the realm of the senses and the body. The Lamarckian adaptive bent in formulations of cultural hybridity explains something of the ways in which race is constructed and pieced together as metonymies of presence. Current scientific positions on race explain how the existence of borderline races and borderline individuals make it impossible to posit pure races. What remains, I think, is for us to understand how and why difference nonetheless sticks to the body. What adheres because it is seen as inherent. Because it is seen as inherent. Unchangeable even when adaptive. Incorrigible despite tutelage. This formulation might help us to better understand how difference is written and read in the body, how it is heard when a country or a people or a person finds its voice in known language but a nonetheless peculiar accent, how it looks and smells and tastes or is exchanged in bodily fluids at the frontiers of the skin. That is to say, we have yet to reckon with how difference continues to be biologized, that is understood as bodily and integral to personhood, how it remains unchangeable even after the best education and accomplished cultural mimicry allow for a polite disavowal of difference in civilized circles, or a version of passing until a reminder or exposure of the truth about origins in less polite ones. Historian Peggy Pascoe suggests that by the 60s, debates about race winnowed down to the single, powerfully persuasive belief that the eradication of racism depends on the deliberate non-recognition of race. However, let's just say, you also know that there are all sorts of anxieties about the Human Genome Project, which worries about how genomics could lead to a new racism. In our own times, this is such a charged issue that to talk about race risks being thought racist. But to accept the indeterminacy of race is far from suggesting, I think, that there is no place for race in social theory, anthropology, literary theory, or science, which continues to use racial categories to collect samples or study predispositions to one or another disease, or to design very useful and necessary public health interventions. Race in this sense is biological because it is that which is bodily. There is unfinished business at hand which requires us to continue to investigate the way in which racial difference is biologized and will stick to the body of a person or a people, even when better science, better theory, and better instincts are urging us to wish it away. What V.S. Naipaul calls the Indian gift for cultural synthesis colludes, however, with a general and what one might call cosmopolite silence on race to dampen our interest in exploring the question of difference, to lead him to pronounce that the racial sense is alien to Indians. Only a sort of cosmo-impolite like Naipaul can get away with broaching this topic. But more recently, novelist Amitav Ghosh has introduced discussion with historian Dipesh Chakrabarty. And some of you may have come across this in Radical History Review. Ghosh, commenting on the idea of not yet in Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, observes that, quote, the idea of tutelage in liberal imperialism is after all founded implicitly on a theory of race. The not yet of which you speak is in fact a not yet forever, which is merely a locution for never, and packed into the forever never is the silence term which makes this line of reasoning possible, race. Chakrabarty concedes the point grandly. The whole question of race is indeed a silent question in India, he ponders, but justifies the omission by pointing to the significant differences in the way in which the Europeans treated the so-called primitives and the allegedly more civilized peoples of India. Ghosh presses on by asking if Portuguese behavior in the Konkan in India is very different from that in Brazil. He goes on then to speculate that the reason why our fathers, and he's actually speaking about his own father and his experiences in Burma, did not speak of racial prejudice and humiliation is because they would have been at odds, quote, with Bengali men's vision of themselves as high caste Bhadra patriarchs, unquote. And this might explain what Ashish Nandi calls the need to forget. Is it possible, he goes on, that we see the silence reproduced in our historiography for reasons that are not dissimilar? Chakrabarty's rejoinder is to appear to concede the argument, but to resist defining racism very tightly, and then to parlay the discourse of race back into homologies between racism and communalism. Chakrabarty's response, I think, is instructive in uncovering certain staples in the Indian stance toward race. It underscores a general reluctance to see the self as raced, alongside a projection of race as a black or other people's problem. It restates 19th century colonial pronouncements about a nominally Caucasian population belonging to what gets called a once great civilization. It redirects the race question towards issues of caste and communalism as more directly relevant to the Indian context. Finally, it banks upon the received agreement about definitional ambiguities to sidestep the question of race while appearing to have engaged with it. Given my project, his insistence on homologies between racism and colonialism prompted me to examine inter-minority politics in Midnight's Children more closely. I'm actually going to spare you a more detailed analysis of communalism, But let me just go on to say that if the problem of communalism, India's peculiar term for religious strife, is spoken loud and clear in the country's voice in the novel, the text of race and color surfaces in a sideline saga of shame and scandal within the family, whispered sotto voce in the vernacular of rumor and gossip, tropes that have been central to the subaltern studies project with which Dipesh Chakrabarti is affiliated. The problem, spoken of in hushed tones when I was growing up, is a familiar one for South Asia. It goes like this. The Indian male patriarch gets entangled, as the euphemism goes, at work with a karanti or karantin, a derogatory term for Christian girls who work as secretaries, are usually racially mixed and economically underprivileged, distinguished from other female employees by virtue of their names, their faith, their verbal tics, and their Western-style clothing, which is in turn associated with sexual availability and allegedly promiscuous ways. Historically, a combination of educational and occupational handicaps effectively confined Anglo-Indian women, or Anglo women, to a predictable range of usually underpaid jobs, where they would be exposed to male advances. Ahmad Sinai's escapades with his poor Fernandas is thus far from being an unusual tale. One day, irked by her husband making googly eyes at Kolaba girls, Amina bursts out. "These Anglos," she said to Mary, revealing a touch of snobbery, "with their funny names, Fernanda and Alonso and all in surnames, my God, Sulaka and Colaco and I don't know what. What should I care about them, cheap-type females? I call them all his Coca-Cola girls." That's what they all sounded like. While Ahmed pinched bottoms, Amina became long-suffering, but he might have been glad if she had appeared to care. Mary Pereira said, "They aren't so funny names, madam. Beg your pardon, but they're good Christian words." And Amina remembered Ahmad's cousin Zohra making fun of dark skin and falling over herself to apologize, tumbled into Zohra's mistake. "Oh, not you, Mary. How could you think I was making fun of you?" I've selected the passage above because it brings the themes of racial difference and the cognate subcontinental prejudice which goes by the name of colorism onto the same page. Very early in the novel, we are introduced to Amina, who was once Mumtaz before her marriage, as Black Mumtaz, who had come out of her mother's womb as black as midnight, and whose dark skin stood between her and the affections of her mother. Years later, soon after she and Ahmad are living in Delhi after their wedding, their coquettish cousin Zohra looks in on the young couple and flirts openly with the young Ahmad, then in the high summer of his charm. When he blushes, she squeals, "Oh, look, pink! But then you're so fair, cousin G. Just like me, don't you think? Lovely pink babies we'll have. A perfect match, no, cousin G? Pretty white couples." With Amina in the kitchen, bubbling and boiling away, Zohra continues, "How awful to be black, cousin G. To wake up every morning and see it staring at you in the mirror to be shown proof of your inferiority. Of course they know. Even blackies know white is nicer, don't you think so?" Spying Amina, who has just walked in, Zohra cries, "Oh, present company excluded, of course." The Reverend Mother and Zohra's prejudice against Amina's dark complexion names a widely shared fear of the negroid skin symptom in the subcontinental psyche. Black and blackie are derogatory terms used by many characters in the novel, including Mary and Amina, while the text makes explicit reference to fair-skinned northerners reviling Dravidian blackies and indeed Pakistanis cursing Bangladeshi fellow Muslims as blackies. Zohra's dismissive comments express not only an aesthetic preference for light skin, but also overt biological references to the reproductive benefits of mating within a color-conscious endogamous group. Zohra also cattily packs into her remarks the shame blackies must feel for their inferior coloring, as something that can't be rubbed off, will not leave the body. Among the many examples of what Salim calls a lack of imagination, we might say, is the failure to recognize the self as race, the lack of a vocabulary, a more locally appropriate term, brownie perhaps, which suggests a continued outsourcing of the problem to Africa. Amina's use of the truncated Anglo is a similar exoticization that recasts the local as foreign, reads the text of a transgressive history in the bodies of the Coca-Cola girls centuries after the wrong side of the bed begetting may have occurred. Ahmad, emboldened by the license awarded for illegitimate advances by this historical backdrop, for transgression, continues his flirtations until the last of the Calico Skirted secretaries quit. At this point, Mary's younger sister, Alice, who had worked for all kinds of bosses and had an almost infinite tolerance of men, the text tells us, or as Mary calls them, the men's, comes on board, bringing her qualities of sparkle and sauciness. Lest we should miss the nuance, Rushdie's detail about the able, available bodied secretaries being calico skirted recalls Portuguese arrival at the shores of Calicut, from which town the fabric takes its name, as well as the mixing that followed. Moreover, having exempted Mary from the Anglo stereotype of cheap-type females, "Oh, not you, Mary," we are reminded of it again in the seemingly innocent reference to Alice's sparkle and sauciness. Furthermore, if we had failed to notice, the passages following this information disclose thinly veiled references to questions of breed and hybridity. I'm going to skip a section here, which the text actually goes on to talk about Ahmad's many pets and his worries about which were purebred, etc. We know that Ahmad himself, marginal in the Hindu national narrative, has long been bedeviled by questions of origin and has fabricated fictional ancestors in a bid to rival Methwold's pedigree. Anxious to impress the departing Englishman, Ahmad had laid claim to Mughal blood. Wrong side of the blanket, old chap, of course, but Mughal certainly. To hammer his point home, Ahmad invents a family curse that will haunt him years later as he tries to remember what he has invented, making the mongrel bitch Sherry the guinea pig for his experiments with the family curse, the text tells us, deflecting his anger at his son's bastard parentage, and proving that one can be haunted as much by a fiction as by the truth. National narratives require that ghosts be exorcised, kept from troubling its fragile fictions. But Salim, cast as a ghost in a family New Year's play at the age of 9, I don't know if you recall the scene where he finds the whole holy sheet and assumes it and comes out as a ghost and is roundly rebuked for it. Salim will haunt the collective fiction of the nation with his own personal version of history from below, trapped between the sheets, as it were, offering exemplary case studies of what the Subaltern Studies group has called the politics of the people, explicitly intended to be read as an alternative to elite historiography. Bless you. Rushdie's excursion through the body politics of the people offers traces of a mode of racial thinking which relies not only on metonymies of presence, as Baba astutely puts it, or only on a regime of looking or visibility, which Kalpana Sheshadri Crooks proposes in Desiring Whiteness, which I think is a wonderful book, but on reworking a scientifically untenable biologism into that which is nonetheless inseparable from the body through a practice of essentialization rather than any kind of demonstration of essentialism. Black Mumtaz and the Coca-Cola Girls may be read deconstructively through the metonymies of skin color, calico skirt, sauciness, or funny names, but they are also whole bodies of evidence which suggest how difference inheres in the body as recognizable in a historically located context. Predictably then, Salim's race to the finish finishes with his return to race, as he finally finds his way to the family fold of the Anglo-Indian community, which is where he should belong, notwithstanding his erudition and the purity of his accents. Endowed with a genetically fortuitous nasal competence and the inability to forget, Salim will smell, taste, and find his way home thanks to, quote, that impossible chutney of memory made by none other than Mary Pereira, whose potentially misleading assumption of the pseudonym Braganza fails to throw Salim off the scent. Salim, relying on the evidence of the senses, is able to sniff and taste his way home to, quote, the only mother I had left in the world, unquote. By this time, Mary's fortunes have changed, and this is not the poor relation we were expecting from aggregate accounts of the historical Anglo-Indian. Mary and Alice, once more conventionally employed, for Anglos, as nurse, secretary, nanny, have now become proprietors of the globally marketed Braganza pickles, with Alice, former Coca-Cola girl, controlling the finances, while Mary, the criminal of midnight, is now rich Mary, who never dreamed she would be rich, and who now drinks 16 Coca-Colas a day. She has consequently lost her teeth. she who never had a voice, and occupies with her sister an apartment in almost the same exact space as that vacated years before by the Sinai family in a demolished palace. Places have once again been traded. The criminal of midnight, now respectable proprietor in the same space where she had been a servant. Mary has fulfilled her early promise as a champion place swapper in a peaceful, private class reversal through a contemporary version of the career of her distant ancestors, the spice trade, which had set them sailing hundreds of years ago. The ghost of Joseph de Costa, instigator of her first pivotal crime, would have been proud, we think, if churlishly so, at the greater success of her peaceful methods, albeit on a scale of 1, at most 2, counting Alice, or let's say 3, including Salim, who is, after all, a fellow bona fide Anglo. In a biographic and bibliographic vein, let me add that Rushdie dedicated an earlier draft of the novel to his family and to his real-life nanny, Mary Menezes, who will never read it. He actually abandoned that dedication, but I'm going to leave you to plumb its import. Mary's crime furnishes the precondition of Salim's presumptuous self-selection as the voice of the nation, allowing him to emerge primus inter pares, after the low-class racial hybrid has been more suitably placed in an outlandish Bollywood-style story of babies switched at birth. The people have spoken, so to speak, in a tale told by a wandering idiot who is, by his own admission, good at seeing ghosts, and recognizes the specters of race and class and the body politic invisible to the others. In yet another unnamed crime, however, we learn that his parents, as far as he knows, never once set out to look for the true son of their blood. A failure he ascribes to a lack of imagination, while acknowledging that worse interpretations were possible, such as their reluctance to accept into their bosom an urchin who had spent 11 years in the gutter. This belated speculative admission might explain why, quote, when we eventually discovered the crime of Mary Pereira, we all found that it made no difference. I was still their son, they remained my parents. As readers of the novel, we have been encouraged to identify with Salim's summary and dismissal of the import of Mary's revelations in his insistence that his hybrid identity makes nothing of his difference. I'm going to spare you. A whole another reading is possible of why it actually does seem to make a difference to Salim, who hotly denies it. But nonetheless, let me say that the fact that Salim's parents have little interest in their real son, impoverished, uneducated, prone to fundamentalism, and ill-bred, doesn't know how to hold his cutlery properly, squares with Nehru's utopian vision of an India which must make nothing of difference or rise above it in order to become possible. This new India, in Nehru's poetic words, would be, quote, above religion because secular, above class because socialist, above caste because enlightened, above hatred because loving, above vengeance because forgiving, above tribe because unifying, above language because many-tongued, above color because multicolored, above poverty because victorious over it, above ignorance because literate, above stupidity because brilliant, unquote. Rushdie goes on to quote this at this length in The Moor's Last Sigh, incidentally. Standing in contrast with Salim's admonition to remember, this elite vision, drawn from Nehru's letter to his daughter Indira Gandhi, might be crudely summarized as a directive to remember, to transcend, and forget. Race and the memory of racial difference would seem to constitute minor items in the long list of what must be overcome in order for India to become civilized, and thus to take its place as primus inter pares, as the first among equals. But the ghosts will nonetheless return, Salim predicts. And to them is now added another mythological apparition with the eyes of widows. Those with auditory faculties to match Salim's olfactory ones will hear the goose-step march of history in the guise both of the fascist agenda of the emergency as well as that of fundamentalist forces under the command of Major Shiva, who has long operated under the worst case of mistaken identity. In Salim's dire vision of the future, however, the war hero Shiva has found out how I cheated him of his birthright. In a parodic repetition of Tagore's Hindu fundamentalist Gora, who mourns a lost Hindu past, sees Muslims and Muslim culture as alien, only to learn at the end of the novel that he, who is unsuspectingly, quote, outrageously white, his complexion unmellowed by the slightest tinge of pigment, unquote, is actually white. Because he is revealed to be the son of an Irishman, orphaned when his father is killed during the Indian Mutiny and his mother dies in childbirth. Gora's subsequent transcendence of race, caste, religion, nation is a matter for a whole another paper, obviously. But I will say in passing that it reflects an ideal of world citizenship that stems from the very same liberal ideology that Ghosh questions. We may read this as Tagore's own utopian view of universal brotherhood, shored up by his denunciation of nationalism in an eponymous pamphlet on this subject. Or we could read it between the lines as a plea to those who forged this liberal ideology to rise above their own parochial, provincial subscriptions. To conclude, let me leave you with the thought that our collective enamorment with liberal ideology, under-investigated for its racial underpinnings, may well lie at the heart of our willful blindness to those questions of race and bodily difference that are nonetheless part of the practice of our everyday lives. Meanwhile, the stairway to an imagined liberal heaven is lined with ghosts we can only wish and wish in vain would stay away. Thank you. I hope that wasn't at too much breakneck speed. The tyranny of the TikTok. Are there any questions I can answer? Yes, Don.
So I wanted to ask you more about what I perceive to be, I guess, a methodological aspect of the larger project that you seem to be working on. So there seems to be, if I understand you correctly, sort of three areas, three themes, each of which is extremely sort of internally complex. On the one hand, race. On the other hand, this very, very complicated novel, Midnight's Children. And then something like the social reality of India itself, right? And I want to ask you about the finding stability in the collocation of these very each of these evidentiary sources or something like that. How do you make the links between those two? Because I wonder if putting two of them together wouldn't make more sense rather than trying to see all three. Do you see what I'm driving at?
Is to repeat what you've said, you're wondering how one takes individually already tremendously complex discourses of race, or the novel itself and the social reality of India, knits them together into anything like a sensible argument. Is that fair?
I hope I said it a little nicer than that.
I don't. Well, I'm still working through this, so I'm going to be wondering how sensible it'll remain at the end. But one of the things, as a literary studies type, and I'll have to say that I'm loath to subject any literary text to the sort of what I've myself sort of thought of as vulgar sociological kind of readings. Don't want to do that. And what I've found, if you'll tolerate the itinerary of my arrival at this particular point, I had started by thinking that I would be making an argument about how Rushdie failed to make a historically located argument for race in Midnight's Children. And what I found was, lo and behold, when in doubt, read the text. And I kept looking because very recently there's been new work on Midnight's Children that wants to look at Anglo-Indian figures. Very good work too, and argues that you have to look at race in a historical context when you're talking about the hybrid. Because that led me to thinking, well, race, qua race per se, where is race? We seem to be very reluctant to bring up race in any event. One of the things I'm hoping will happen is that the sort of complexity that's being suggested in sort of juggling all of this stuff is suggested by the situation. and that there's no way in which one can simplify what is already very complex. And nothing is more complicated than a literary text which is working in a genre where it's not invested in any kind of bottom line argument in the way that some of us are even in literary criticism. And that not only generates complexity, but then it obliges us, I think, to have to not to simplify what is complicated. So I am very hopeful that what I've started to do in Native Intelligence, which was to look at post-colonial literature not only as post-colonial but as literature, continues to happen because the genre is a consideration that's going to allow me to see how these elements are kept in play while there's a sociological and historical backdrop, rather than just any very close, oh look, this is how it is and this is what the text is doing. And it's not just aesthetic because it's metaphorical or whatever, but because it deals with the body. And that's something that's been missing from readings of the aesthetics so far. And I'm very emboldened and heartened by the fact that aesthetics has returned in a major way, but the bodily hasn't. And that's a material context, I think, that which allows for those kinds of readings that are alert to sociological and historical matters without giving up on the literariness of the text.
I would actually go back to the question of methodological. I have this methodological question, and I'm working in a very different field. I'm not familiar with the literary field at all. But I mean, the question is that when you were reading passages from Rushdie's text, as you yourself mentioned, that race, I mean, there's too much of complexity in there. And we can see race and color relation, race and caste relation, race and religion relation, and then there is this whole idea of the colonial native Indians vis-a-vis their relation with the empire builders. So my thing is that if race, and I would agree that yes, there is a huge resistance on the part of India to recognize race as a viable category of analysis. I think India is resisting being a forum of the racial discrimination forum at the UN, and because it says that caste is an internal matter and caste and race cannot be equated. But I think the university that you come from, Gyan Pandey, is working on this relationship of race and caste. But my question is that how, if, I mean, the moment you say that, well, we need to see race as well, my question is, if it is so difficult to tease apart, I mean, if you look at the relations in day-to-day, everyday practices, yes, people talk about color, but can we say that this is a racial thing? How are we going? I mean, I understand it's probably, when you're reading these literary texts, you can see those complexities, but in a very, say, day-to-day ethnographic field, and when we're working, is there a way to say that, well, this is racial, and this is caste, this is, the division between North and South, the Dravidian race, that is the only category, whereas all others are all mixed. But the race color and the race caste distinction, I'm not able to understand how. And you mentioned Dipesh Chakravarti that he's resistant, cultural or not. But if he says that caste is a viable category rather than race, I would go with it at this point in time because we can still understand it within the cultural context. But how would you say that? How do we tease apart that this is race, this is caste, this is language, this is religion, this is color?
The question is about primarily race, caste, color, and
Yes.
how they interweave. And I haven't actually been able to include a very modest exploratory section of the paper that tried to look at not just a by now sort of hackneyed proposal that caste, the word for caste, which is a Portuguese word, obviously, within the indigenous lexicon would have been varna, which, whether or not we think of that as color, can at least be thought of as type, right? And that's where I began to find some clues as to the kind of typological thinking that might be common to the idea of race and caste. And this is something I had also arrived at in going back at looking at the nexus between race and aesthetics, but going far back beyond the 18th century, where aesthetics is usually located, with Kant's work in the on the critique of judgment, etc. But going all the way back to Aristotle and Plato and so on to look at what is a prehistory of race, so what predates race and what becomes race. The mobile history of the idea of race could be understood a little bit, if you want to look at it as prehistorical, more broadly in terms of type or genus. And when I started looking at the word miscegenation, for instance, I found that when it comes from genus, genos, people, and that it shares roots with Sanskrit, jata, jati. So we'll run into what may not be. I'm not sure what the purchase would be of saying this is caste, that's, but there's a certain sort of thinking, and if you're asking how will you distinguish typological thinking, which appears to be the way in which we function and operate anyway, because otherwise we go crazy. How do you distinguish that from race? And I don't know that, to me, the notion that what's more relevant for India is a study of caste is a way of disavowing something that's also there. And it doesn't have to be a race for primacy. This is more important or that's more important. When you say you'd rather go with Chakrabarti's notion of caste as a viable, is what you're saying, he's endorsing the idea of this being an internal matter. Of course.
He didn't say it's an internal matter or anything.
That was India. But it's sort of, when you're saying it's viable, it's because, it's historically located and there's a particular purchase to it. Any sort of functioning of race is historically located, and that's why we have so much trouble defining it. And I'm not even trying to compare what's happening in India to what happened with Africa and so on, which is usually how we end up distancing ourselves, but to see, well, what would happen if you started looking at brown, and which hasn't been activated. There's some modest work by, modest beginnings, I should say, Vijay Prasad's work, The Karma of Brown Folk, which again, looks at the question of race in the American context. But it's like, what would happen if we started looking at brown as a color worth thinking about in the racial encounter structure? So I'm heading there. And what I'm getting at repeatedly is that aesthetics remains a very productive way of looking at what is going to stick to the body, what sticks to the body of the woman, that which inheres. And that's the closest I'm getting to, in a way that I can't get to that sort of conclusion, even preliminarily, with caste. You see what I'm saying? That's the way in which I'm trying to sort through. And it won't be adequate to every purpose. It may not be adequate to the sociologist or another sort of person, but it seems to work for now, as I try to work through all of this. But I appreciate very much what you're saying.
We need to have one last question.
Gosh, I'm not going to pick between you two. You go duke it out.
I wonder to what extent you allow for race to be a constructed and imagined thing rather than a given thing, because of course the body is never just the material biological facts of the body. There's an important gap between sensory data, what we actually perceive and what we think we perceive. I wonder if the same thing can be said of race when you call somebody Pago because they think that they're from this Portuguese lineage. Well, there's something important there. What they think they are is very important to how they live their lives and who they are as an individual. So to what extent race itself is something that we create for ourselves rather than something that's given biologically or something.
Well, in fact, thank you for helping me try to sort this out at the end, because this is very, very important to me, that nobody hear what I'm saying as an argument that race is essential to the body. We have to, at this point, it's too late now for us to ignore the substantial advances in the discourse on race and racial thought, which have led us very clearly to the conclusion that race is constructed. But what is fascinating to me is that if race is a fiction, we continue to produce it. So how does race continue to be produced in a way that wants to try to biologize or make bodily what is not scientifically tenable bodily, using whatever does appear on the body? And I'm not just saying appearances, because you can be Anglo-Indian and dark, white, and whatever. We all know that doesn't work. But whatever is seen in the body in a specifically located historical context. So this same person, the Coca-Cola girl in a calico skirt, is not going to be read. It's the process which wants to become, it's an essentialization practice, is what I'm saying. Of course race is constructed, but how the bodily gets activated in it to produce that fiction, as if it were inherent.